Good evening. I'm David Day, the host of Asian Review, and you're watching a special program that we're bringing to you entitled Japan's Regional Defense Developments. And to help us with this discussion, we have former retired Colonel Marine, Mr. Grant Newsham, with us in the studio. And Grant, nice to have you again.
Well, thanks very much.
And I should tell our audience that Grant is a retired colonel now, no longer with the United States Marine Corps, and he is a strategic research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies in Tokyo now. And that is what type of organization, Grant?
It's a small think tank in Tokyo, and it focuses principally on defense and security issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, the last time that we had Grant Newsham in the studio with us to do a show, he was in uniform with the Marines, and we learned at that time that he was the liaison officer between the United States Marine Corps and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, the Japanese Army. Do I have that right, or have I?
That's right. No, it's the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, or the Japanese Army.
So this particular show is going to be very unusual because Mr. Newsham is extremely well qualified, and he has been the, I guess it's fair to say, the principal point person for the development of some different capabilities in the Japanese military.
I played a role in it.
You played a role in it. Okay. Well, you're very humble, Grant. But let's go back to kind of your the genesis of what's been happening, and we are in this show going to be talking about not only the very recent development of Japan's amphibious capabilities, but we also are going to talk about kind of the larger role that Japan has been is now playing in the Japanese military in the region. And Grant, before we get to your observations during the Fukushima Tohoku earthquake period of time regarding the amphibious capabilities or lack thereof, how about give our audience kind of a quick historical picture of the way that the Japanese military has operated since World War II?
Well, it's had a self-defense forces made up of air self-defense force, maritime self-defense force, and ground self-defense force. So basically Air Force, Navy, and Army. Historically, however, they have not cooperated much with each other. There's been some legal restrictions on that, political restrictions. And really for many decades, the Japanese self-defense force was, you'd have to say, marginalized. It was almost an embarrassment to the country. And I would say that and it was underfunded. You had a situation where Japanese officers could not wear their uniforms on public transportation going to and from work. But it was something that, it was a military, but nobody wanted to think of it as a military. And it was really sort of a second-rate operation, the way it was regarded. Fortunately, there's been some signs of change.
Well, this marginalization of the Japanese self-defense forces, and this is the period of time from, say, September 2, 1945 up until recent. Why were they marginalized? Was it a punishment for losing a war, or?
Well, that has something to do with it, of course. You know, if World War II ended the way it did, and they did discredit militarism, the armed forces to a large degree in Japan. So it took a number of years for Japan to develop out of this, and you had almost a faux pacifism which took place. And I use the word faux pacifism is because Japan could present itself as a pacifist country because it had the Americans doing most of the defense. But that was something that couldn't continue for a long time, forever. And the Japanese military did. It it sort of kept faith, and it did continue to develop in the right direction, but it was definitely stunted owing to political restraints.
And in that stunted management process, was there a kind of a siloed effect between the Navy and the Army, and they didn't talk to each other, they didn't cooperate, they didn't work together? Is that a fair description?
That's correct. That silo effect was about as strong as it could possibly be. And when we started to, when I got there, I remember hearing the Japanese Army telling me, well, the Japanese Navy won't work with us, they won't even talk to us. Japanese Navy would say something similar, well, the Army won't work with us. And the Air Force was just sitting off to the side somewhere.
Okay, Grant, we've got folks listening and watching this program all over the Asia-Pacific region and on the U.S. mainland as well as here in the Hawaiian Islands. And let's just, in a short fashion, but still as part of the introduction for this program, let's hit the fast forward now. Mm-hmm. You've given the kind of the historical, this is what the background looked like. How about give the audience now, come all the way forward to today and give us the kind of the short version of where they are today, and then we'll fill in between in how we got from point A to point B during the course of this program.
Okay, well, putting it simply, on March 11th, 2011, when the tsunami and earthquake hit, the JSDF's response, they responded quickly, but they demonstrated they could not operate in any useful joint fashion. Okay, so wait,
so for our audience, were you personally on the scene at that point in time?
I was in Tokyo, and it took me about 5 or 6 days to get up to Sendai where the relief effort was, but the Marines got there within about 2 days, so I had to catch up.
But when you caught up, then were you not in that area so that you could personally observe this siloed lack of coordination?
Yes, I was right there.
Okay.
You could see it. So you had that situation, and Operation Tomodachi, as much of a success as it was, it did demonstrate the shortcomings of the Japanese Self-Defense Force in that regard. And now to fast forward from 3/11/2011 to about June 2013, you had...
It's 2 years.
That's right. It's little more than 2 years. You had the Japan Self-Defense Force demonstrate in Exercise Dawn Blitz in Southern California a very good ad hoc amphibious capability, which required the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy to work together in ways that nobody thought was possible. So in a little more than 2 years, the JSDF went from almost no capability to a pretty good ad hoc capability.
And that movement from the two silos that weren't talking to each other and no amphibious capability to what you've just described last summer at Camp Pendleton, you played a role in that whole significant movement, did you not?
I played a role. There were others who did as well. So I don't want to overstate that.
I understand. Okay. And so after the observations that you made at during the course of Operation Tomodachi and the Great Tohoku or the Fukushima incident, you got some kind of orders, did you not, from the Marine Command here at Pacific Command to do what?
Well, I was designated as the liaison officer to the Japanese Army, and that was the first one there had ever been in 65 years. We were late getting to that.
65 years.
We had never had a Marine liaison officer to the Japanese military, as far as anybody knows.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, okay, and so what were your instructions? What were your orders?
They were vague, which was good, but was to represent the Marine Corps in Tokyo, which really is the center of gravity in Japan, but also to represent and promote the U.S. Marine Corps' amphibious capabilities. This know-how, this experience that we have, which was directly relevant to what the JSDF needed to develop, and to represent, really to promote and explain the Marine Corps' special role.
So, give me the short answer. What did you do with those orders?
We tried to make something useful happen.
And what were you trying to make happen?
Well, you wanted the JSDF to have an amphibious capability, which requires a joint capability. And when I use the word joint, I mean it simply means having the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army cooperating. And it's nothing more than a symphony where you want all the parts to play together smoothly. And that was the objective.
And why couldn't they do this themselves? Why do they have to have, why was it important to have an outsider come in?
Well, I'm not sure if the expression gaiatsu applies, foreign pressure, but you had, in all three services, you had officers who understood what was required. But sometimes it takes an outsider to come in and say, look, this is the situation, this is what you need to do, this is how you do it. And in some ways it provides some cover, provides some encouragement, and it is useful for changing thinking.
Looking at where we are today as a consequence of work that you have done and others that you have worked with, the Japanese military now has a capability to provide more robust participation in humanitarian efforts, do they not?
Yes, they do. They demonstrated it actually a couple months ago down in the Philippines.
And this is with that response to the Typhoon Yolanda?
That's correct, John.
And what kind of response were they able to do?
What the JSDF did was they put together, on extremely short notice, a task force made up of amphibious naval ships, about 600 or so Japanese Army soldiers, and their equipment and helicopters, and they put this together on the fly and sent it down to the Philippines. At the time, the JSDF was in the middle of an exercise down in the southern oceans. So they stopped everything, put the task force together, and went down to the Philippines and conducted a very useful humanitarian relief effort.
And the type, here's the part that I guess I want to be clear on. I'm not sure that I understand it. But the type of response that the Japanese recently made to Typhoon Yolanda in Tacloban, was that remarkably different than the type of humanitarian response they were able to do in their own country in response to the great Tohoku earthquake?
I think it was. You know, they've gotten better at it. They say this was done really on just at the drop of a hat, and they did it smoothly and quite effectively. Tohoku and that earthquake relief was really a very ad hoc, haphazard effort, and you didn't have anywhere near the cooperation between the services which you had in the Philippines. And this is the result of what has happened in the intervening 2 years or so.
What we're gonna break for a moment here, Grant, and when we come back, I want to talk about, just very briefly at the outset of this program, the change in Japan's ability to defend its islands as a consequence of this new Japanese military, if we can. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, David Day. We're here with retired Marine Colonel Grant Newsham, who was the former liaison with the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. And we're talking about Japan's regional defense developments. We have more. We'll see you after the break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. You're watching Asia in Review, and we're talking about Japan's regional defense developments. with a senior research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies in Tokyo, and also a former U.S. Marine Colonel, Grant Newsham, who used to be the lone officer liaison in Tokyo between the United States Marines and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. So right before the break, Grant, you were talking about this kind of almost mind-boggling progress that the Japanese have made in developing, one, military coordination, and two, an amphibious capability. And right before the break, you were talking about their performance in response to this phenomenal typhoon in the Philippines at Tacloban, at Typhoon Yolanda, and how much different they were able to perform now than they could in response to the whole Fukushima event. Let me just jump ahead to one more quick question, and that is change in their ability to defend their islands.
Well, that's gotten better as well. If you take a look at the map of the southern islands.
All right, well, let's do this. Mr. Producer, if you could put up for our audience photograph number 3, if you would. Visual number 3, okay. So there you have the southern islands with Okinawa in the middle. The top on the right of the chain there is the lower tip of Kyushu Island, I believe, all the way down to Taiwan. So continue. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Well, if you look at the map, you see a lot of ocean, and you see some land as well, and you see a lot of air. And you have got to have the ability to operate from sea to shore, from shore to sea, or an amphibious capability. You have to have air, sea, and ground capabilities, all of those, in order to operate effectively. Previously, Japan simply didn't have the ability to do that.
Do you mean that those islands include, and I'll include the Senkakus, which are not in that island chain, they're in the middle between, roughly between Okinawa and the China mainland. Are you saying they, up until June of this year, they really didn't have the ability to defend those islands? Is that what you're saying?
They had the ability to defend it, but not effectively.
Ah, okay.
You could have done it with one service individually, but you need that cooperative approach. And they simply didn't have the capability to do that. They've developed it very quickly. What they did in Dawn Blitz in Southern California, they could do down there.
Mr. Producer, let's go to visual number 5 here, if we could, for our audience. And Grant, what are we looking at here?
What you're looking at is an Apache attack helicopter, which is on a Japanese Navy ship.
Now, this is a U.S. helicopter?
No, it's Japanese. It's a ground self-defense force helicopter. It is an American model, the Apache, but it is being serviced and loaded and refueled by Japanese soldiers. Say on a Navy ship. It is going to fly onto that island, San Clemente Island, to fire at targets. And this is something which people thought impossible just a few years ago.
Why?
Well, you didn't have the cooperation between the services. Plus, it was considered somehow, in a very sort of misunderstood way, it was thought offensive, and there was almost a taboo on the JSDF doing really what was necessary and commonsensical to defend its own territory.
Let's go, Mr. Producer, to photograph number 6, if we could. And let me ask you something. Is this a picture that you took, Grant?
Yeah, I knew I was watching history being made, so I had a little camera with me.
I don't understand the history that's here. So it looks like you're standing on the bridge of a ship. Mm-hmm. How about explain this picture to our audience? What's there?
This is the Japanese amphibious ship, the Hyuga. And this is from the bridge, and you have U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine advisors, observers on there. You have the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Army's there, and there was Japanese Air Force actually nearby. And so you have the three services together. You have the U.S. forces working very closely with them, trying to share our know-how with them. And once again, this was something that Nobody thought it could happen.
Okay, Mr. Producer, photograph number 7, if we could. What's happening here?
Here you have the commanders watching the fire support exercise on San Clemente Island. They're watching from the Japanese ship, the Hyuga. And once again, you can see the Japanese Navy, Japanese Army, and Japanese Air Force.
So that's history right there.
You knew what you were seeing, and it was pretty unusual.
Mr. Producer, photograph number 9, if we could. What are we looking at here?
Once again, you have, in one of the staff meetings, you have the Japanese Admiral, Japanese General together. And really what was noticeable about this was the wonderful cooperation between these two gentlemen. And that was largely responsible for the success of the exercise. And it was that personal relationship and the responsibility that was so effective.
This relationship that you're talking about, Grant, the key to this relationship has been the involvement by you personally and some of your colleagues, almost acting as mediators, if you will, to get them to talk to each other. Isn't that correct?
Well, you don't want to overstate it, but there's a degree of truth to that. Sometimes it did, at the beginning, people telling you, well, we won't talk to them and they won't talk to us because they don't like us. A little bit like a marriage counselor, a little bit.
Okay.
But realize that within the Japanese services, there's plenty of officers who know what needs done. What they needed was the opportunity. And once they had the opportunity to work together and to conduct this sort of exercise, it came pretty fast.
Okay, Mr. Producer, let's go to video number 1, if we could. And so tell us what we're looking at here, Grant. What is this?
It's a Japanese Navy LCAC. It's basically a hovercraft which you can use to bring large amounts of supplies, vehicles, and personnel to shore. It goes obviously from ship to shore and from shore to ship.
All right, and so when this Operation Dawn Blitz took place, you moved from the Japanese ship that you were on effectively to the beach to watch the landing, did you not?
That's right. I got to go off by helicopter from ship to shore to watch what was going on.
Okay, Mr. Producer, let's go to video number 2 then. And why don't you tell us what's happening here? You're on the beach, and you probably saw a scene something like this, right?
That's right. That would be the view somebody who shows up on one of the southern islands would probably see before too long.
Okay, and then what is this?
Once again, you've got an LCAT coming in.
All right, and you saw these LCATs from the beach.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
So this would have been your view?
A little off to the right, but basically the same thing.
Okay, and so this is the view, that one would expect when the Japanese military is arriving on one of their islands, this is what it's going to look like.
Japan now has the capability, and that is the key thing. They have the ability to do it. This also has a very solid use in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations.
What does this vehicle do? What is it? Does it carry anything?
Mm-hmm. It would have, in this case, probably has vehicles on it.
All right, and so here we've got it. The rotors are slowing down. It settles down onto the beach. What kind of vehicles can it carry?
It can, jeeps, tanks, armored vehicles. Just about anything you
pretty
can think
big
of.
stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, do you remember this scene?
Yeah, I remember that.
So this right here, we are observing kind of a piece of history to be able to coordinate the coordination and then the amphibious capability all pulled together, somewhat similar to the capability of the U.S. Marines.
And I would stress the U.S. Marines and the U.S. Navy. Because within it is that cooperation which is essential, unless we learn to swim a whole lot better. But that's what you're seeing, and it's you had Japanese Army, Japanese Navy working together to accomplish this.
All right, let's go to photographs number 10, Mr. Producer, and let's see what we've got here. So help us with this.
What you've got is U.S. Marines and the Japanese Army doing a helicopter fire support exercise on Camp Pendleton. But what this gets across is the depth of relationship between the Japanese Army and the U.S. Marines now. I've trained in Camp Pendleton for about 5 or 6 years now. This is furthering that. And one of the reasons for the success, Japan's success, is the fact that the Marines on Okinawa have finally started to pay a lot of attention to the Japanese military instead of looking at the other rest of Asia.
What's the significance of that?
We had tended to ignore the Japanese military for many decades.
As being incompetent, incapable? Why?
Well, there is a tendency to sort of downplay their capabilities, but there was just a notion that if Japan needs defending, the Americans will do it. That worked for a good long while, but at some point that pathologic dependency cannot continue politically.
Okay. Let's go, Mr. Producer, to photograph number 11, if we could. And is this when this exercise is finished now?
It's pretty close to the end, and that's the Admiral Yuasa and General Nozawa at a press conference, and you have a Marine General there, Navy Admiral, and you also, just out of sight, you have New Zealand officers and Canadian officers as well. And what this typifies, in one sense, is the Japan Self-Defense Forces sort of move outwards. This inward focus is pretty much over, and now they're taking some very normal steps to just establish normal relations with other countries in the region.
Okay, let's go to one other very unusual photograph here. Look at, Mr. Producer, how about put up photograph number 4 if we could? What is this? Is this an Osprey helicopter?
That's right. That's the Marine Corps Osprey. It's landing on the Japanese ship Hyuga. Once again, this was a first as well, and it's once again, this is symbolic of the improved cooperation and operational cooperation between U.S. and Japanese forces.
So the pilot of this aircraft is an American.
It's a Marine.
He's American Marine, and he's landing, or she's landing, right on the deck of a Japanese ship.
That's right, Joe.
It's a new era, isn't it?
It is, and even very sensible people thought this was impossible.
Why do they think this was so impossible?
Oh, you get used to it. If it's been 60 years with very little progress, one tends to think that it will always be like that. And I think there was a sort of underestimating of what Japan was capable of.
And we'll talk about what Japan is really capable of and what they did to accomplish this in this very short time since Fukushima after the break. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Day. You're watching Asia in Review, and we're talking about Japan's regional defense developments with Mr. Grant Newsham. And we're broadcasting from the Pioneer Plaza right here in the core of downtown Honolulu. Stay with us. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
Aloha. I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. We're live. You're watching Japan's regional defense developments. This is a special program by Asian Review, and our guest is a former U.S. Marine colonel who was the liaison between the Japanese Self-Defense Forces and the United States Marines in Tokyo for the last 2-3 years, something like that. Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about some rather remarkable and very quick changes that have been coordinated in Japan that resulted in kind of a history-making landings at Camp Pendleton of an amphibious and a coordinated nature between the Japanese Army and Navy. And we've been talking about an enhanced humanitarian response capability. And so the first question I want you to address is what we were talking about right before, is the you know, the phenomenal speed with which the Japanese accomplished this. And Grant, maybe explain this to the audience with kind of the speed of American development, the U.S. development of the same capability, or the Australian development, if you would.
They did it very fast, and I think part of the reason is because it's the Japanese. You know, these people know what they're doing, but also they took what almost seemed like an ad hoc approach to it, and they almost did it the reverse of how we would have done it. They did not have a systematic, very detailed plan with milestones and timelines.
Right.
They just went ahead and took the hardware they had, took the people they had, and went out and basically played baseball. They almost did it on the fly, but they got results, and I think that is the reason it went so fast.
You know, if you think about that capability, you know, imagine if that were applied in other aspects of Japanese life, in its corporate culture, in its government, in its finances, in its academia. I guess the rubric that you are laying out here is never underestimate the Japanese.
Certainly not, and I would also note that it is the Japanese self-defense force. You know, I mentioned it having been marginalized and belittled for much of its existence. But you get in there, and once you get to know the officers and the enlisted, these are some of the best and most flexible thinking Japanese you'll come across.
This remarkable improvement takes money to do this. So how does this financing of this new Japanese military fit with the defense guidelines and the realities of Tokyo's budget process?
Well, there's a small problem, is they're not willing to pay for it yet. The recent defense guidelines which were announced were very good. In every respect, they were sensible. They stressed joint operations, amphibious operations, the need for improved communications, the right focus in the southern islands, and defending Japan's territory. But there's one small matter, is they didn't put in the budget to do what is necessary to upgrade the JSDF.
Okay, so we've got a long-term budget problem that's got to be fixed. Sounds familiar.
It is. And it is bedeviling. And you would compare this almost to someone building a house. And they have some nice plans for it, a really nice house, and you have the carpenters and the architect and the bricklayers all ready to go. And then the owner decides he's only going to pay $100,000 when it cost $1 million. And you would have to say that somebody's not serious about this. The amounts of money required really aren't even small change. It's less than that in the context of Japan's larger economy.
Mr. Producer, let's go to visual number 1, if we could, here. And for our audience, you're looking at a map of the Asia-Pacific region. And then, Mr. Producer, let's go to visual number 2. Grant, this particular slide, if you will, shows the two-island chain concept of attack or defense, if you will. What is this all about?
It's really a demarcation, sort of as the Chinese see it, and everything within that first island chain is Chinese thinking, is Chinese territory, and they have stated their intention to dominate that. Beyond the second island chain is just a farther area that is marked off. But it's that first island chain which is in play these days, and that is really what's being what the jostling is about.
So that's kind of the area, the general area of confrontation between muscle flexing between China and Japan.
That's right.
And is this muscle flexing, this Senkaku dispute, does that play a part in the phenomenal explosion of capabilities of the Japanese military?
It does, but it's not the only reason. There's been concerns with the PRC for a number of years. So it's part of the reason, but it's not the only one.
On a different topic now. Prime Minister Abe recently visited the Yasukuni shrine, and all kinds of criticism from China, from Korea, not so much from other Asian countries, but also from the United States. And because you have worked as an American diplomat in Japan, you have worked in the private sector in Japan, and you've worked for the American military in Japan, and you're now a think tank type guy in Japan. What help us now get inside the Japanese mindset from their perspective. Why is this Yasukuni shrine, why is it so important? Why does the Prime Minister want to make visits to that shrine? It's something that has been troubling me for years. I want to understand more about that.
Well, he feels he has to go.
Okay, I got that.
You know, he just feels he has to go. You know, I would tend to take him at face value when he goes and says he wants to worship for the souls of the dead. As I see it, rather than trying to explain the psychology of this, Yasukuni is almost a Rorschach test. Everybody sees it a little differently. And so if Abe goes, you have, as you pointed out, a lot of people going berserk. You have others who just don't care, so it's something. It's ultimately, as I see it, it's a distraction.
Okay, but I think the audience in the U.S., those of us who are at least partially up to speed on Asian foreign policy, we understand the negative reaction to the visit or a visit to Yasukuni.
Yeah.
What I want to know is what's inside the Japanese mindset. How do they see this, the ones that care?
Well, the ones that care, one aspect of this is that you have the duly elected prime minister of a democratic country who decides he's going to visit a war memorial, and that he should be able to do that. There's others who basically just don't care, and then there's others who think, well, look, we're going to be criticized no matter what we do. We're going to go. Why? It isn't that big a deal.
Well, is Yasukuni the equivalent of is it Japanese Arlington?
It's not that different. But this is an argument of angels on the pin. How many fit on a pinhead? And it drives the international commentariat nuts, trying to figure this out. But as noted, I've always seen this as a distraction. But whether or not it's in Arlington, that is debatable, and I have read plenty of the debate. You might compare this to a case of say, an American Indian group demanding the president not visit Arlington because you have General Sherman buried there, who said the only good Indian's a dead one.
Okay.
And yes, that could be a very strongly held opinion. There would be others who would disagree. But as I said, I do see it as a distraction that really takes our eyes away, takes us the attention away from more important things Japan should be doing and that the United States should be doing.
Well, it certainly has been a unbelievable distraction, and wasn't it a prior visit to Yasukuni in Prime Minister Abe's prior life as a prime minister that caused him a lot of negative points?
I think he didn't actually go. I think it was Koizumi, the predecessor. But it's an issue. But as you noted, most of Asia doesn't pay attention. When one says Asia is upset, you can say China and Korea. Say the rest of Asia has a very different attitude towards Japan and the Japanese military.
Meaning?
That they welcome actually a more capable JSDF, particularly tied in with the United States. And you can go to, once again, it's Japan's relations, military relations with India are strong and getting better. good relations with India. Vietnam's building up. Australia has developing relations with the Japanese military. The Philippines have welcomed the Japanese armed forces. And so there's more to Asia than just China and Korea.
So are you? So you're basically saying that with the exception of China and Korea, the rest of the region is really welcoming these new defense and military capabilities of Japan.
Yes.
Interesting. Very interesting. We've got an email from one of our listeners near Washington, D.C., and let me put the question to you, Grant. This person says, "It has been said history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Do you see similarities between the present and the period of the 1930s?" Now, I don't know whether this question is referring to China or to Japan, but I'm assuming it's to China.
Well, I think you could use just the Japan-China region, and
Okay.
that would do fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I think you could, in some ways you could probably interchange the word Czechoslovakia for Taiwan, and you would not recognize what was written in the 30s and what was written today. But you, ironically, you almost seeing a reappearance of the notion of appeasement. And appeasement has not always been a dirty word. In the 30s, it was considered a sophisticated, nuanced approach to foreign policy, which meant that with a...
This is the Neville Chamberlain approach.
That's right. And that if you understand what is making an aggressive country act the way they do, if you engage with them, assuage their fears, that they will then behave better.
Okay.
And you do not want to provoke them, and that includes a military buildup. And but you have to, I say, you just have to understand why they act the way they do, and address and placate them, accommodate them, and that was appeasement. And it may have a different name today, but it certainly seems similar. Another irony of this is if you read and listen to what is coming out of the PRC, it sounds very much like what the Japanese were saying in the 30s. So there are certainly some similarities that I think would give them, you take note of.
Would you say that an example of this type of appeasement that you're talking about in the context of China and Japan is the way that the response was made to China's imposition of this ADIZ, air defense zone?
I think that's not a bad argument. It did look as though the initial response of sending B-52s through was a conscious decision not to appease, but then very shortly afterwards requesting that U.S. air carriers cooperate with it. It watered down the effect. I would suggest Scarborough Shoals, that incident a couple years ago.
This is off the Philippines now.
That's right. The failure to even speak up for that certainly had a whiff of something out of the 30s.
This is the failure of the U.S. to speak up against the Chinese movement into Scarborough Shoal.
It did seem that way. One hopes it is not our era's Rhineland.
Okay. What about the South China Sea area? And we'll come back to this because we're going to take a short break here, Grant. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Japan's regional defense developments. I'm David Day for Asian Review, and we're talking with Mr. Grant Newsham, former U.S. Marine colonel with extensive experience in Japan, a former American diplomat, private sector executive, and now a strategic research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, a think tank in Tokyo. We'll be with you right after the break. Stay with us.
I'm Jay Fidel. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
We're back. I'm David Day for Asia in Review. We're talking about Japan's regional defense developments with former Marine Colonel Grant Newsham. And Grant, let's talk a little bit about U.S. relationship with the Japanese military. What should the next step be now? Where do we go from here?
What I'd recommend really is to more fully integrate U.S. forces with Japanese forces, include things. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, for example,
you have joint contingency planning. You have integrated command and control systems, interoperable communication systems, more training, more patrolling together, particularly down in Japan's southern islands. It is that fundamental, that a strong U.S. military JSDF relationship really is a key stabilizer for the region.
Stabilizer in a military sense, but isn't it also a powerful humanitarian response team for the two of them really working together in other areas, as they did in Tacloban?
Oh, that's exactly right. Japan has the capability, and it just needs to improve it. And there's no reason it could not do humanitarian assistance operations throughout the region. Nobody would complain. Obviously, it depends on which part of Asia you go, but in general, they would be quite welcome. It's an appropriate thing for Japan to do.
You know, one last area of questioning before we wind up the show here. I'd like to know what is Japan doing with some of these other countries that you've mentioned, Vietnam and Indonesia and so forth?
Well, it has really, in the last couple of years, has really increased the rate of and the level of interaction with other countries in Asia. Particularly, I've cited India before. Recently, you've had Defense Minister Onodera visiting India, and there were some agreements reached on moving forward the joint air, sea, and ground activities. They've been more active in Australia. They've actually struck up a relationship with the French down in New Caledonia.
Really?
Indonesians have a pretty good relationship for a long time. It's not well known that when the tsunami hit on March 11th a couple of years ago, the ground self-defense force was actually on the verge of doing probably the largest exercise they've ever done out of Japan with Indonesia. But you go down the list: East Timor, the Philippines, Japan is just doing more, and these are very normal things. And I do want to stress that Japan is not a threat to anyone. It's been the best behaved country on earth in the last 70 years, and even if it built up with everything it says in the new defense guidelines, it would be incapable of of attacking its neighbors. It's about as much of a threat as Canada is to the United States.
And that's because of an attitude?
Well, partly an attitude. It's one, nobody is interested in starting a war with anyone. Nobody in Japan is interested in attacking anybody, and that is really what is key. I say the distraction over Yasukuni, I say it diverts people from this understanding that Japan is a pretty peaceful country and is not a threat to anyone, but also it simply does not have the manpower, the hardware, or the money to be a threat.
You know, Grant, we're out of time. And I want to thank you for, first of all, for your service to our country. Secondly, I want to thank you for your enormous contributions to the mediator, partial point man effort that you've made in helping the Japanese military rise to a new level so that they can be a successful global player with other militaries in the region. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your time here. It's great to see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching Asia in Review, and we're out of time here. We've been talking about Japan's regional defense developments. Please have a safe drive home, and we'll see you next week.